Well, very good. Well, once again, welcome. I hope we have, I'm hoping we got everyone. Yep, 16. It looks like almost everyone here has had an opportunity at least to introduce themselves. And once again, hopefully in this short time that we have together, we can create at least a group or an environment or a space where we can share these ideas together. After that was very engaging this morning with our speaker, I felt, especially in talking about the issues of equity. And so as we, and this is the only time that we'll share this or present this breakout or be together in this workshop. But I really think as we look at unconscious bias, the microaggressions, and as we look at how do we capture or how do we recruit and retain our students of color, our students more marginalized in the STEM area. I really think that the things that she talked about fit nicely into and are a precursor to what we're going to be talking about in this session. I want you to realize that one of our rules here or norms is that everybody, we're all learners. I'm sure some of you here in the audience can teach us. And so I look forward to us in a give and take, two-way communication and sharing that. And then when you came onto this share screen, well, you'll need to, did you click on the box for the audio?
Yeah, it should have the audio.
Okay, great. All right, well, once again, welcome to our presentation. It's entitled today, The Unconscious Bias and Microaggressions, the Impact of Racial Inequities. Some of you might have a stereotype of Utah, where you may think that we're very monocultural, monotheistic, and one main religion, et cetera, in the state. But we are along the Wasatch Front, where many of us from Utah, well, with Nathan, Paul, and I, and Davis School District, some of the others, we really do have a lot of diversity. And just like the rest of the nation, we are also looking at how do we create these safe spaces for all of our students. And so for today, we're fortunate that we were asked to present this, and we look forward to our time with you. So we'll go on to the next slide. So our objective this morning is that, or this afternoon, but today, hopefully as participants, especially with this MESA group, we will discuss cultural identity, unconscious bias, and microaggressions. In addition, hopefully we'll identify ways to interrupt this bias and microaggression with our students to create safe, supportive, and equitable learning environments. There are some, hopefully we can get to the tools or some strategies that you can be using specifically with our students or as we're working in our MESA clubs, or depending upon what our responsibilities are or the avenues that we have, taking back this presentation to others and being able to share this with others in our group. All right. So as we began this year, thinking about this school year, but thinking back to March when many of, in Utah, I'm going to speak from the perspective of Utah. In March, we were asked, we then came to the dismissal of schools as a state. And so, so from March clear on to now and everything, just like the rest of the nation, we've all been being exposed to the pandemic, to many things that are out, that are in our surroundings, our environment, that have created a very new normal for us. And as a result of some of these feelings and the situations that we've been going through, we realize that, through social emotional learning and working with our students, that many of our students are experiencing these new feelings and new anxieties. And so how do we address this, or the impact of what's been happening around us, and also bringing it into the forefront in the discussion of how does it impact our racial inequities in our school, or how are we promoting racial equity in our schools? And one of the, CASEL, if any of you are familiar with that in the educational arena with social and emotional learning, one of the programs that they have talked about, or roadmaps that they have put out, includes this one question that we wanted to also share with all of us today. How do we create authentic and brave spaces for students to have conversations about the layers of struggle in our current moment and the effect it has on them, their families, and their communities? Nathan, I'm not sure why there's all these extra black lines or spaces, but then every once in a while it covers up my my screen.
Imagine-
Hopefully most of you can see majority of this screen. So as we look at this screen, and Nathan, if you'll click one more time, there are some captions underneath each of the screens. Many of you have seen this before, but before we deal more with looking at equity, equality, social justice, and looking at racial equity and inequities, let's look first of all at very basic definitions. The first picture to the left is equality, right? Every student, well, they're all trying, the object here is just to see the game, right? Or have the clear vision. Equality means that everyone gets the same thing. So they each got the same block to stand on. Unfortunately, though, one of our students cannot see it all. And the other two are able to see it, but maybe one has better access than the others. So the outcome is they don't all have an equitable access to the playing field or to see the full pleasure of that whole game. Equity, however, means that we are then given exactly, the resources that we need so that we can participate fully and achieve the most potential that we can. And so you see here, the first student didn't need the box at all, but the second student has at least one box so that second student can have access to the game, the visuals there. And the third student then gets an extra box. So once again, the outcome is all students, based on equity and having the equitable access, they are now able to access the game and see that. I think many of us understand the equality versus equity piece. I like what Enid Green says, one of our researchers in the multicultural world, who says, that equity is the process for equality, and equality is the outcome. But let's look at the social justice, or we could even relate that to racial equity, when we're looking at removing all barriers and all challenges so that all students have that full access to their achievement or to the best potential. So I just wanted us to keep that visual, that graphic in mind as we're talking about equity, equality, and how do we get to that social justice. So thank you. Let's move on. As we are, once again, we're only together for a short period of time, but even in this short period of time, I'd like to share with you some agreements from Glenn Singleton in Courageous Conversations About Race. And we use this in many of our workshop settings. First, so to stay engaged. I know it's really hard, especially when we're doing something virtual. We might be distracted with other things that are going on, but we hope for the next 40 minutes, you'll be able to stay engaged with us. You may experience some discomfort. Some of us may not have had any discussions before about race or racism or equity or marginalized, or we're going to talk about Black Lives Matter, and the national impact of that. So hopefully understand and realize that you might experience that discomfort. Speak your truth, realizing that many of us here in the state of Utah, we, as a foundational piece of diversity awareness, we have incorporated, actually it's out of Washington State, the REACH training, Respecting Ethnic and Cultural Heritage. And the first perspective of REACH is that we all come from and we all have different perspectives. So engaging in and acknowledging the fact that we all engage in multiple perspectives, we all come from different cultural lens, different experiences, etc. The fourth is to expect and accept non-closure, in that we have such a short period of time. So we're just touching the surface in this discussion that really takes on a much broader depth and space than what we'll have time to talk about. So in prefacing what we're going to talk about with unconscious bias and microaggressions, and going back to what I had alluded to earlier, remember the COVID-19, the pandemic has created a lot of feelings, experiences for us that are so different. And a lot of us have been touched deeply because of perhaps experiencing not only the illness, but deaths, et cetera, et cetera. Here in Utah, we've had over 3,200 earthquakes. And believe it or not, and the earthquake started 4 days after March, when we went into the dismissal. We closed down our schools, which was fortuitous in the fact that one of our schools experienced, $1 million in damage. So in a way, it was great that, not in a way, but it was fortunate that our students were in school. But you can see with COVID, the pandemic, the earthquakes, and then looking at what has happened nationwide, as we've witnessed, Black Lives Matter and the experiences there, we know that all of the things that have happened in some of your areas, fires, maybe some of you might have experienced hurricanes or storms. There's just been a lot that's happening over the last little while, which has impacted or also added more anxieties, perhaps, and stress and stressors to our students, our faculty, our staff, ourselves, our families. Nathan, please. So before we go any further, I mean, I've talked a lot about these feelings, anxieties, etc. I'd like you to think of two words that describe the way you're feeling as a result of some of the stressors or the events that have taken place. In the interest of time, if we could have you, we could all view the chat, but if you would think about two words about how you're feeling and write those two words in the chat, that would be great for us to be able to see that. I'll just verbally share my two words with you are anxious, anxious to get back to some kind of normality. And my second word is grateful, though, very grateful for everything that we have. Thank you, Erica. Awareness, empathy, anxious and motivated, stressed but hopeful, scared, hopeful, grateful, hopeful, fatigued. Thank you, Dwight. Hopeful and tired. Yeah. Disconnected, hopeful, burdened, but hopeful. So thank you for all of you in sharing those. But once again, taking that opportunity to think about and reflect on tired and accepting. Catherine, thank you for that. But as we go forward, let's go on to the next slide, Nathan, and keeping those thoughts and feelings about how we are feeling. Our question here, so is, Dwight, thank you, optimistic, tired, yeah. How are you really? But thinking about this so how are our Black and Brown students feeling? In addition to everyone else, but have we asked them, especially in light of the Black Lives Matter? Of course, we've just gone through the elections and everything else, and there was a lot of turmoil. There is still some going on right now, but there's just a lot of feelings that have created the situation for all of us and these stressors, perhaps. What about our faculty and staff? Have we stopped and asked them? Or the members on our MESA team? Once again, putting this into perspective for our MESA group. Do we have those conversations with our other staff members? And how will you validate students, parents, staff members as it relates to issues surrounding Black Lives Matter? Once again, we all come from different perspectives. In the state of Utah right now, in my own district that I've worked in for 25 years, there's some even though as through the years as we've talked about race and racism and how to create anti-racist environments, et cetera, it's still very difficult in a very dominant, white, privileged, male, patriarchal kind of community. I'm not saying anything. I don't mean to be downplaying or creating this awful scenario, but in reality, the privilege that those that are in power and the privilege that they have, and in working with them, sometimes it has been a challenge, but yet I'm grateful that they are at least allowing us to share the message and get the message out. So once again, each of us in our different communities have different perspectives that we're dealing with. And each community, each state, each university, each school district has their own challenges, so to speak. So really stopping and asking, have we asked, how are we doing? How are we feeling? So very quickly, and some of you can probably even address this even better than I can, but for those of us who may not know more, have not done much more with Black Lives Matter, I just wanted to, because what we are seeing or hearing is why Black Lives Matter, all lives matter and everything, but we at this point in time to acknowledge the fact that all lives matter, but however, right now, we're looking at the Black lives and what needs to happen so that we can stop the systemic oppression or the institutionalized isms that are going on, and that we acknowledge if we're not familiar with what's going on. We're going to take a little time just to do a little bit of some history. And I acknowledge there's probably people here on this that are on this workshop that have even greater knowledge than I do, but I wanted to share this with you. From our perspective, sometimes in our district, they don't, the understanding may not be for what is the systemic oppression, and I don't see it in our schools, but what they haven't talked about too is the institutionalized isms that have been created over the years. And so let's just go back over 400 years ago when we look at slavery. The US has a complicated history with slavery and how that contributed to the disparate outcomes for Black people. Such as wealth accumulation, looking at redlining. If you haven't looked at redlining or you're not familiar with that, look at that and see how that has created disparities and systemic oppression in that wealth accumulation. What about access to quality health? We don't all have the same level of health care. And what about even in education or even equity in policing as we look at that? But all this goes back to, looking at what policies and practices do we have in place that we might have the opportunity to influence or to change. So when we think about this and we go back to, okay, the slavery, and then we know the 13th Amendment did away with slavery, but it instituted yet another form of slavery or enslavement, where there's a little part in the 13th Amendment that says, quote, except for punishment of crime, unquote. So we know that if there was a crime that had been committed by a black man, Black person at that time, they were then incarcerated. They were then put back into jail, and then from there working in the fields. So once again, they went back out into the fields and they provided that, that work there. So another form of enslavement. But so once again, just thinking about, and if you haven't seen 13th on Netflix, just to plug in there for you to see that more in-depth history and to understand that. Then we see Plessy v. Ferguson that created the separate but equal in 1896, then racial segregation, the Jim Crow laws. So there's much more that we could talk about, but then coming back to this mass incarceration and the school to prison pipeline. Some of those things are institutionalized within our schools where we have seen the data that shows that our students of color are more likely to be suspended, expelled, et cetera. And then of course, it brings us to the most recent injustices of the murders of George Floyd, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, Trayvon Martin, Breonna Taylor, and others, et cetera. And so when we talk about Black Lives Matter too, I'm going to share this with you in our district because I was asked to share this because once again, if you weren't with me earlier, our student body is very, very diverse. We're a majority school district demographics, but our leaders are still very predominantly white. And so many of them trying to understand Black lives to them was all about just policing and just about the violence. But if we know about how Black Lives Mattered, we're three sisters, three Black women, after Trayvon Martin, who was killed, and then Zimmerman was let free. And Trayvon was just going to get a bag of Skittles, but on that way home, he lost his life. He was killed. But the three of these women got together and then created, and wrote a poem. It went on Facebook. They coined the phrase Black Lives Matter and then put a hashtag on it that created this movement. And so you need to understand that if you listen to them and how they started it as well, yes, policing was part of it, but it wasn't the overarching, because right now, so many people think that it's only about violence. It's only about protest. Protesting is good. Protesting is good in a certain way because it can get our laws changed and everything. So once again, in looking at Black Lives Matter, I'm hoping that those of you in the audience understand the importance of that and why it matters for us to ask our kids and talk to our students. And so I'm going to go into the very next slide, which is a video that I want to share with you from a student and her perspective of what this means to her.
In a world so full of color, why would I choose to be colorblind? With all the blue in the sky and the green in my eyes and the orange of a monarch butterfly, why would I choose to be colorblind? See, so many teachers have said to me in an effort to promote inclusivity, I don't see color. An otherwise harmless statement, but when it comes to race, it's not quite the same as you think. What you mean is that you love all of your students equally. All the students you have the capacity to serve, but in actuality, your students are not all treated equally. And they're also different colors. The last thing you want to do when it comes to race is erase the things that make us unique, erase a piece of what we see staring back at us. It's not about not seeing color. It's not about negating it. It's about celebrating it and raising the voices of Black authors, Black activists, Black leaders, Black heritage, Black existence, but resisting the single narrative. Resisting the story that Africa is one big territory with nothing but huts and famine. It's examining our own biases, our own prejudices, and accepting that you are not immune to making mistakes. So make them. Then take them as an opportunity to learn, because isn't that what we're here to do? Isn't that the spirit we're fostering? It's exhausting being young and Black in the country we're living in. Your students are exhausted, but not giving in. When it's been 400 years, you learn to cope. So I hope you take their hands and make an effort to understand and see color. Then read about it. Go to BSU meetings, be about it, meaning roll up your sleeves and apply what you're learning. Don't rely on the one Black student in your class to carry their entire community on their backs. Don't ask them to preach, but allow them to speak their truth if they so choose, and use their name. Even if it's hard to pronounce, announce your allyship. Wave it like a flag across the room. You have the opportunity to make your space a safe one. So take it and name racism when you see it. It's not teasing, it's feeding the beast of white supremacy. So seize the moment to dismantle the hate and educate. It's what you do best. Address the uncomfortable, lean into what is difficult to talk about, because it all starts with conversations, hard ones. We must talk about redlining, talk about healthcare inequalities, talk about employment disparities, talk about hair and how all hair types are professional. Racism is not conceptual, it is real and it is perpetual. It is not political, but it is critical that you use your audience to promote tolerance. Talk about it. Read about it and be about it. See color, then use it to paint a better future for your students.
Thank you for your comments. I've been reading your comments, but I just love to hear what Verlene says. It really is powerful as a student, from the student's point of view. So once again, asking all of us to make sure that we're in touch with our students, talk to them, ask them how they're feeling, ask our staff, everyone else as well. But we'll make sure that you have access to all of this PowerPoint and to everything else as well. And so once again, so if we go on to the next slide, and I just love at the end where you just see her take this deep breath too, right? And just kind of exhale. But when you look at some of the things that she's talked about, this then is, we're gonna take some of her ideas or some of her comments out. And when she talks about our cultural identity or see color, even being able to identify who we are and working with our students, have we given them an opportunity to identify and given them permission and a space to identify who they are culturally? And then we're going to look at, based upon our culture, our intersectionality or our cultural identities, it also determines our biases, or what our unconscious or implicit bias might be. And then we'll look at microaggressions as well. Yes, Janet, everybody else, we will make sure that we share the link for the video. So once again, we're going to look at these three topics, and we're going to do it in a very quick way. And so I apologize for not having enough time to do this, but at least it'll hopefully pique your interest, and then we can always do more discussions offline as well. All right, so if we go on to the next one, cultural identities, I want to just spend a little time on this. I think many of us on on screen today have already done some of this, but it's important for us to look at, first of all, the basic definition of culture. It's a system of shared beliefs, values, customs, behaviors, and artifacts with which the members of society use to understand their world and one another. And as we go to the next slide, some of you have seen, many of us have seen the iceberg. An iceberg, we only see 10%. We liken that into our surface culture. So as someone comes into the room or right here on screen, we can make assumptions about what I look like and what Nathan or Paul looks like as well, just from what we see. But what's hidden is the 90% below the surface. And that only through taking time to build relationships with others will we get to know what's below the surface as far as cultural identities and building relationships with others. So on our next slide, I believe we have the diversity wheel. On the diversity wheel, you see that in this, and you have a copy of this in the handouts. I think Manny and Dwight, you might have come on later. We do have a link for handouts that you're welcome to use and have access to. But if you look on the inside circle, there are these 6 characteristics, cultural characteristics: physical abilities / qualities, age, sexual orientation, identity, ethnicity, race, and gender. Well, the significance of those being in the center is that they rarely change. They rarely change. However, if you look on the outer surrounding circle, the different cultural characteristics, those are components that do change. For example, marital status could change. I was married for 46 years and now a widow. So that has changed for me. But about our education, some of us that might be working on other degrees or whatever, but our careers. So you can see that in this core center, our cultural characteristics or identities that don't change or rarely ever change. And then on the outside are cultural identities that do change. So I want you to take a quick minute and just do a free write of all of your characteristics, because I just want you to try to think about who you are. So for me, I'm cisgender, female, Native Hawaiian, Chinese, English, educator, mother, grandmother. So if you wanted to just quickly, just for you, just to think about, write that down or think about it. So hopefully you had some time to write about that or write some identities down. So I want you to look at your list, and I want you to pick out maybe just two that are the most important to you. That if somebody said, if someone came in and said, you can only keep 2 of these, what would the 2 be? And in the interest of time, I'm just going to share with you in previous sessions that we've had more time to discuss this. We find that most of them, based on intersectionality, and competing, all these different cultural identities that we each own, that some of them that they choose to keep, majority of them, it was race and gender. And so if you chose others, then I want you to, this is what I'm hoping you'll think about though. The 2 that you choose then are the 2 areas that most likely are so important to you that we need to consciously be aware of. They could influence our biases. So the purpose of doing this cultural identity idea too is to think about, where might my strongest biases lay? All right, we're going to go ahead a few slides. So unconscious, there we go. Implicit and unconscious bias. So looking at this, what is unconscious bias? People of all backgrounds show unconscious preferences on the basis of gender, race, sexual orientation, or other aspects of identity. And we just went through that very quick practice on looking at our own personal cultural identities. So continuing on, we're going to, I believe, there's an infographic, and you have this in your handouts as well. When you think about unconscious bias, what is it instinctively categorizing people and things without even being aware of it? And how do we deal with our biases? Well, you can look at all of those, but number 2, think critically, attend to data and evidences, look at problems as a diamond, with multiple facets and not as a coin with only two sides, a right or wrong, or left or right, or what, so thinking about this and going through, I really like, it may be a little busy for some of you, but it has some very important points for us to think about when we're looking at unconscious bias. Okay, Nathan, please. We're going to share this video with you. Procter & Gamble has done several different 1-minute clips. And so think about this and think about what this man is going through on a daily basis. With think about that, and that is powerful, I think, and just looking at that short 1-minute clip. But I want you to think right now then, here's a judge, and this is what he goes through on a daily basis, and it's almost like he's trying to, we're almost trying to prove sometimes that, we're a good person. This is, but what about our students? What are we doing with our students? Are they getting these unconscious how shutting down, or that we are biased towards who they are or who they represent, or etc. But really, as we go through these things, think about how are our students reacting to this? How do we deal with this? What are we practicing? For some reason, double check says my speaker's not or whatever, but is that better? I'm hoping it's a little bit better. All right. So once again, the unconscious bias, and thinking more about and reflecting more about how are we working with our students? What are we saying? What are our actions? Are we including everyone? Or are we unconsciously? And remember, as an unconscious bias, we may not even know that. So we might need to rely on our colleagues. We need to check each other, and have those check-ins with one another to say, are we excluding someone? How am I in relating with one another? So let's move on to the next slide, please. There's a study that deep-rooted biases hinder our best intentions. There's an article that we shared with you from Fearman, who's actually a teacher who wrote about unconscious bias within in her setting as a teacher. And she learned, it says, learn how to recognize and address them. Educators, he told me, frequently notice misbehavior among Black students while ignoring the same behavior among white students. Sure enough, when I observed more carefully in my class, white students were doing the same thing. And without realizing it, I had selectively noticed the misbehavior of just one subset. Once again, it goes back to our biases, or, thinking back to also our own cultural identities. Which one, which areas are we stronger in? And realizing, how might that influence our bias? Let's move on. I believe there's a Stanford study here that I wanted to share with you, a couple of comments. In the Stanford study, the goal was to understand the role unconscious bias plays in the disproportionate punishment of Black students compared with their white students. In the study, teachers were shown student discipline records with randomly assigned names. Half of the names suggested the students were Black, half of the names suggested the students that the students were white. Well, you can guess in the results of this study on the next slide. As a result of this, the researchers found that teachers were more likely to assign a harsh punishment for repeated misbehavior to a student they thought was Black than to a student they thought was white. And in this study, teachers' perceptions of students' racial identity influenced how they chose to respond to student behavior. So once again, as teachers with MESA or whatever our responsibilities are, really thinking about, are there biases in there? There was a question on the chat that, maybe we can get to it towards the end, but if we can hold off for just a few minutes, because I think that was a great question for us to answer. And I don't have access to the chat all the time, so I'm not sure if somebody has answered that or not. But Nathan, let's move on to the next slide. Once again, we'll give you have access to our PowerPoint with all of the links to the videos and et cetera. And if you haven't taken the time to do this, we encourage you to even look at the implicitharvard.edu link that will take you through a lot of different biases, exercises to test your own biases. If you haven't done it, it was very eye-opening for me. So we'll move on to the next, please. It brings us to microaggressions then. Microaggressions are defined as the everyday, subtle, intentional, and oftentimes unintentional interactions or behaviors that communicate some sort of bias toward historically marginalized groups. What I wanted to share about with microaggressions as well, I believe our next slide, if you want to go to the next slide, Nathan, might be a PowerPoint. We won't have time to watch it. But if it's one of the professors is talking to her students in one of her in her classes, and several students are talking about the microaggressions they experience every day. I had an opportunity to meet with our high school students from one of our high schools. They were all seniors and they were starting a youth diversity outreach club. And they were presenting to myself and the administrators at their school. And these all three of them, unfortunately, not one of them was in MESA, but they should have been, and we're trying to recruit them. But they were very articulate in letting all of us know, and they were all three students of color and diverse in their sexual orientation, et cetera, as well. But they were very open and very honest and just saying every single day that they come to school, they are bombarded with microaggressions from their teachers, statements that we'll talk about or we'll look at in our handout on the next slide, but statements that they hear every single day. So it's like they hear these, if you want to go to the next slide, I think it shows that, Nathan, these different kinds of statements that the students are bombarded or shared on the students or said about the students from teachers. And so they say when they go home at night, it's like all they can do is like recuperate, reflect, and replenish and re-energize so they can come back the next day just to be exposed to these same racial aggressions. So once again, if we want to get our students involved in MESA and being in the STEM programs or being more, looking at what we were talking about this morning with Kamal and Ms. Sinclair, thinking about what are the things that we say, and we may not be the purveyors of these comments, but how do we interrupt what is being said to our students, to our colleagues, without shaming them or creating a hostile environment for others, but taking the opportunity for us to be able to share with our colleagues and share with them the importance of us being able to interrupt these statements. So some of these things on this page here talk about, it talks about the theme, the microaggression, and the message. So for example, I'm just going to share color blindness statements that indicate that a white person does not want to acknowledge race. So some of the statements might be, well, when I look at you, I don't see color, or America is a melting pot. And the other one is, there is only one race, the human race. Well, those are microaggressions, but then here's the message. What is the message that they're saying? When I look at you, I don't see color. What's denying a person of color's racial or ethnic experiences. Or if you say America's a melting pot, it's like assimilation and acculturate to the dominant culture. We're not really teaching integration, right? Or looking at integration. Or there is only one race, the human race. It's denying the individual as a racial cultural being. So I don't think we've really sat down and thought about these sometimes. So I encourage all of us to think about this. And like I say, I'm not saying that we're the purveyors of it. I know I've said before, until I learned that I'm not to say it anymore, is like, well, that's a gyp. Well, that's a microaggression, and that's a direct relationship to gypsies and a different way of life. So those are the things that I think unconsciously we don't realize. One of the things we have to share with you is, Nathan, if you'll go forward a couple of slides.
My name, when I started kindergarten, was Ramon. And by the time I was in the second grade, everybody was calling me Raymond. Out in the playground, in the classroom, Raymond, hey, Raymond, hey, Raymond. And trying to adjust to this, you know what I mean? And if there was a girl named Maria, her name became Mary. And Juanita became Jane. So one day, we got a new student by the name of Facundo Gonzalez. Facundo Gonzalez, man. When he came into school, we noticed they called it an emergency administrative meeting. You kind of hear him talking to the door. What are we going to do with this guy, man? You know what I mean? How are we going to change his name, And one teacher goes, well, you know what? Why don't we try to shorten the name a little bit? And they go, yeah, well, but how do you spell it? Facundo. They go, well, why don't we just spell it FAC? And one of the teachers, well, that would mean his name would be Fuck. And the other teachers looked at him, no, that sounds too much like a dirty word. You can't be saying fuck. Where's your homework, Where's fuck at, you know what I mean? So that was a trip we always remembered going to elementary school, because Facundo was the only guy who never got his name changed.
We look at microaggressions. One of the microaggressions is that we do shorten our students' names, or we may not be able to pronounce them. I have to, as a Pacific Islander, I do well with Pacific Islander names and everything. But I know I have a challenge with Vietnamese names, and so I have to work on those. But I share that with you because that's a very typical thing. As a principal going into an elementary school, a student came to me and I knew his last name should be said Vake, and I mentioned that to him, and he said, oh, you're the first person that ever says that, because he introduces himself as Vake. And, so it's just something that stayed with me. And if you look at the microaggressions, let's even work on saying their names correctly. All right. So let's move on. So we talked a little bit about unconscious bias, our cultural identities, microaggressions. As we move on, how do we interrupt this? This is a great tool from Teaching Tolerance. You can teach it to your faculty, your staff, your MESA staff members, but most importantly, you can teach it with your students as well. In our department, we've given it a title of IQE squared: interrupt, question, educate, and echo. And it's a way that we can interrupt and speak up against biased remarks every time in the moment, without exception and without shaming anyone. So if you hear some words, so if for example, we hear this all the time in class, right? Oh, that's so gay. So how do we interrupt that? How do we stop that? In a way that is meaningful and is also a teaching moment without shaming, etc. And so saying things like, that phrase could be hurtful for some. Let's see how else could we phrase that? Or we can ask simple questions in response to hateful remarks, like, what did you mean when you said that that's so gay? And talk about it that way, perhaps. Or even educating. So explain why a term or phrase is offensive. Do you know the history of that word or what it could mean? And then echo. We sometimes forget about the echo part. It's if someone else speaks up against hate, thank him or her and reiterate her anti-bias message. One person's voice is a powerful start. Many voices together create change. So all of our voices together in speaking up and and reiterating, the importance of that anti-bias message is a powerful piece. So thanks for speaking up. I agree that word is offensive and we shouldn't use it. So thank you, Allison. for reminding us about that. This is a, once again, in your handout, if you look at the handout itself, there's 2 of these on the page. You cut them off, you fold them up. It's a little pocket. It can be put in your pocket, your wallet, your purse, wherever, or it could be put out on your desk, right there. But it's something that in your MESA clubs or opportunities in working with kids that you could all work with it together. Right. Thank you, Angela. When students, it's really powerful, like hearing the students from the high school talk about the microaggressions that they received every single day was very powerful for us as adults in that room that particular day. So let's move on, Nathan, please. So to bring us to the end of our time, it's important that we don't say nothing. And that's a campaign from Teaching Tolerance and Anti-Defamation League. We have to speak up. Let's talk. All of these are live links to articles and to more projects that you could do collectively with your MESA groups. On the next slide, I believe we have some books that we've done as a group. So you want to talk about race, how to be an anti-racist, white fragility. I'll tell you what, white fragility was a real challenge for many of our faculty, but it's important that we have these conversations. As we go on to the next slide, I believe it brings us to our one of the final thoughts that I want to leave with us today. We started a little bit late, so I do want us to just spend a few minutes listening to Representative John Lewis. I love his last letter, his last thoughts that he left with all of us. As we started off in the beginning, I asked you to think about how you feel through all of this. And so I want you to think about, I know some of us said that, we were anxious, that we might, well, I can't even remember all the words, but we might be anxious or there's difficult times, etc. But many of us also countered that with being grateful and hopeful. So let's end on the words of John Lewis as we all work on this together and as we get more of our students involved in our MESA and STEM programs and provide equitable access and safe environments for all of them. So here's the words of John Lewis.
Though I was surrounded by 2 loving parents, plenty of brothers, sisters, and cousins, their love could not protect me from the unholy oppression waiting just outside that family circle. Unchecked, unrestrained violence and government-sanctioned terror had the power to turn a simple stroll to the store for some Skittles or an innocent morning jog down a lonesome country road into a nightmare. If we are to survive as one unified nation, we must discover what so readily takes root in our hearts that could rob Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina of her brightest and best, shoot unwitting concert goers in Las Vegas, and choke to death the hopes and dreams of a gifted violinist like Elijah McClain. Like so many young people today, I was searching for a way out, or some might say a way in. And then I heard the voice of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on an old radio. He was talking about the philosophy and discipline of nonviolence. He said we are all complicit when we tolerate injustice. He said it is not enough to say it will get better by and by. He said each of us has a moral obligation to stand up, and speak out. When you see something that is not right, you must say something. You must do something. Democracy is not a state. It is an act, and each generation must do its part to help build what we call the beloved community, a nation and world society at peace with itself. Ordinary people with extraordinary vision can redeem the soul of America by getting in what I call good trouble, necessary trouble. Voting and participating in the democratic process are key. The vote is the most powerful nonviolent change agent you have in a democratic society. You must use it because it is not guaranteed. You can lose it. You must also study and learn the lessons of history because humanity has been involved in this soul-wrenching existential struggle for a very long time. People on every continent have stood in your shoes. through decades and centuries before you. The truth does not change. And that is why the answers worked out long ago can help you find solutions to the challenges of our time. Continue to build union between movements stretching across the globe, because we must put away our willingness to profit from the exploitation of others. Though I may not be here with you, I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart and stand up for what you truly believe. In my life, I have done all I can to demonstrate that the way of peace, the way of love and nonviolence is the more excellent way. Now it is your turn to let freedom ring. When historians pick up their pens to write the story of the 21st century, let them say that it was your generation who laid down the heavy burdens of hate at last, and that peace finally triumphed over violence, aggression, and war. So I say to you, walk with the wind, brothers and sisters, and let the spirit of peace and the power of everlasting love be your guide.
So with John Lewis's words and everything, we leave this message with you and look forward to continued conversations as a collective group in MESA, and that we can meet the needs of our students and create equitable and safe spaces for all. Thank you for joining us. We'll stay online if there's other questions some of you have specifically asked. But have a great day.